Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Tatiana Shalkivska. I'm with the World Bank Hydromet Program of the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the second Global Weather Enterprise Online Forum entitled Increasing Socio-Economic Benefits of the Weather and Climate Services through Public, Private and Academic Collaboration and Partnership. Before we begin, let me brief you on the housekeeping policies. Please, during the event, mute your microphones and disable your video. The moderator and the panelists may keep their video on. Use the chat for questions and comments and wave your hand to ask a question during the Q&A session. The event is video recorded and the video recording will be available at a later date. Having said that, let me introduce Vladimir Tsurkunov, lead specialist and head of the GWE Hydromet program, who will make an overview of the event and welcome you. Over to you, Vladimir.
Thanks, Tanya. I guess it would be good if you can just put the agenda on the screen. And welcome everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, colleagues, our regular and new participants. I see many regular participants of the Global Weather Enterprise events. And some of you may recall that in February we organized our third webinar dedicated to a private sector perspective of collaborative future of the Global Weather Enterprise. I just want to let you know that you can find the recording of that and other interesting events on the Global Weather Enterprise site, which is very simple, www.globalweathergweforum.org. And you can find, as I mentioned, quite a lot of interesting things today. Our today event is a second Global Weather Enterprise online forum at which senior representatives of public and private sectors will discuss how to increase the socioeconomic benefits of weather and climate services through collaboration and partnership. As always, we have an excellent panel and a moderator. But before passing the floor to Dr. Jack Hayes, who will moderate this forum, let me first introduce and give the floor for opening remarks to my manager, Mr. Niels Holm-Nielsen. And Niels, before you're connecting, let me brief participants who you are. And Niels is a practice manager and the head of the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery. And I guess you know used to this abbreviation GWE from the World Bank. Niels is a Danish national and he joined the World Bank in 2006 as a junior professional officer in the Middle East and North Africa region. He has since held several positions in disaster risk management in the Latin America and Africa regions, including most recently at the World Bank Global Lead for Resilience and Disaster Risk Management. Before joining the World Bank, he worked for the Inter-American Development Bank, where he helped create the corporate policy on disaster risk management and established DRM as a development practice. Niels, I hope you can hear us and can join. Welcome, floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Vladimir. I see you nodding, so I expect you hear me okay. Excellent. I have some connectivity issues at home. I suppose my kids are using the bandwidth of my Wi-Fi. Yeah, that's the... Look, well, welcome first, everyone. I guess I'm speaking in an institutional role here. That's what Vladimir asked me to do. I'm relatively new to my institutional role. I think of myself more as a operational practitioner in the field of disaster risk management, in which the World Bank bundles hydromet early warning systems and what relates, a lot of what relates to the Weather Enterprise Forum and its activities. But I'll play my part and go through the formal proceedings here. As Vladimir mentioned, the Global Weather Enterprise Forum continues its efforts for the whole hydrometeorological community to deliberate and share opinions on these key issues that concern stakeholders in the public, the private, and academic sectors. And this is the second event, but there's also the Global Weather Enterprise parallel series of webinars and weather pods. The subject of today's conversations directly addresses the high-level theme of our program. As a starting ground, I want to recall that the two overarching questions that were presented in a recent World Bank report, the power of partnership of public and private engagement in hydromet services. And these questions were, what are the characteristics, advantages, challenges, and potential risks of the various public-private engagement models in the hydromet sector, and what are the available options for developing countries that wish to streamline and augment public and private engagements to strengthen the provision of hydromet services, and accordingly, what are the conditions necessary to succeed? So these are the two of the key questions that came out of this, and we hope today's event will help share some light on some of this. We look forward to hear from the distinguished panelists on this, and through the webinar series in general, we're exploring opportunities and challenges in different components of the weather and climate value chain, like open data policy, the future of numerical weather and climate predictions. And at our first online forum, which was organized together with the WMO back in January, expert panelists discussed the critical importance of legal frameworks and to enable the effective cross-sector partnerships and to remove barriers. And earlier this month, we had a distinguished panel discussing issues around gender equality in the global weather enterprise, which of course is a key dimension of sustainable growth for this work. Now, innovation is no doubt key, maybe a key word, to increase socio-economic benefits of weather and climate services. It enables continuous improvement to ensure people's safety and economic growth. And innovation and technology can contribute to maybe maximize the impact of engagements, but only when it's coupled with innovation in business practices. We trust that the experts on the panel today will lead us to a great conversation around some of these points. And before I close my opening remarks, allow me to highlight another critical question. The World Bank and our partners are keen to enhance the impact of our investment projects in developing countries. And I hope that this conversation today will contribute to identify maybe new approaches in making investments more impactful and sustainable through better cooperation of public and private sectors. And then finally, I want to re-emphasize that the goal of the Global Weather Enterprise Forum is to create an environment for substantial growth of the global weather enterprise. And this cannot be achieved without the growth and tight collaboration of all stakeholders from the public, private, academic, and other sectors. Cross-sectoral partnerships are the fundamental basis, we believe, to advance our effort in this regard. So I look forward to the conversation, to the discussion, to listen to the panelists. And now let me turn it back to Vladimir to proceed. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Niels. I can't disagree with anything you said, as you may imagine. Dear participants, we have now 122 online. Let me pass the floor to our moderator, Jack Hayes. And before doing that, let me also, while most of you, I guess, know who Jack is, let me formally do what is needed, presenting him. Dr. Jack Hayes is a retired weather executive, engaged now in part-time consulting for the World Bank and the Barron Weather Company. Dr. Hayes' previous experience includes 20-year career in the Air Force, 12 years at the US NOAA, and 7 years in the private sector. During government career, Dr. Hayes held several leadership positions, including, again, commander of the Air Force Weather Agency, and director of the U.S. National Weather Service. In addition, he was the vice president for weather products and service for the Harris Corporation before retiring from the full-time employment in 2018. With that, Jack, please take a lead and floor is yours.
Okay. I would like to do one quick tech test. We had some technical troubles. Wasila, can you hear me?
Vasily, you seem to be muted.
Yeah, I can hear you, Jack.
Good.
Can you hear me?
Good.
Yes, just
All right.
fine.
Thank you very much. I'm back. Thank you.
Those of you who have been in the weather business and have the stress of putting out an important forecast and having a system go down just before the forecast is due, I think can empathize with what was going through my mind when we couldn't communicate with Wasila earlier. So I'm glad at least I can go with my plan. I'm going to keep my remarks short and my introduction short. First, I want to thank those 6 people who are going to participate in the discussion today. They're all busy people. I talked with probably 25 different people as I developed the agenda for today's discussion, and I cherry-picked these individuals because they had perspectives that I thought would be good for you all to hear. And I'll share one other personal experience. I had my first interaction with the private sector when I was in the Air Force. And I will tell you, I didn't trust them further than I could spit. And I learned by taking a risk and engaging them that I grew in appreciation for the culture that exists out there, their motivation, and that has stayed with me and done nothing more than strengthen throughout my professional career, both in the public and the private sector. And it's engendered in me a desire to help push that forward. So when Vladimir asked me to do this, I said, sure. And so we'll see where we go. When you start down the path, you say, I can solve world hunger with my seminar. And I got rid of that notion early on. So if we can initiate, as a result of this discussion, some engagement somewhere, whether it takes the business forward or not, that's not my objective. It's to promote an engagement between the 2 sectors, not to leave out the academic sector. They're important to this as well. So let me start with a quick introduction to the 6 people that I have. And I'll start with, and I guess it would be appropriate, Tanya, if you can bring up the slides. Okay, so from a current NMHS, I've asked Dr. Cornelia Radics from Hungary, who is the director of the Hungarian, or the president of the Hungarian Meteorological Service. I heard her give a talk at the WMO Data Conference back, I think it was November, and she struggled with a policy challenge in the European Union, and I was really impressed with how she handled it. And so I'm going to ask her a few questions about leadership later in this discussion. Next slide, please. Number 2 is the guy we've had trouble connecting with, and it's Wasila Pio. I've known Wasila for, she's over 15 years for sure. I first encountered him, I did just under 2 years on the WMO staff in the mid-2000s as the director of the World Weather Watch Department. And one of the challenges I faced was building capacity in developing countries, and that brought me into association with Wasila. I saw a lot of great ideas, and in the time I've worked with Wasila since, I've seen nothing but a commitment to building capacity in developing countries and innovative ideas. Next slide. Last, on the public sector side, there's a guy I worked for at WMO when he was the Assistant Secretary General, and then he later became the Deputy Secretary General, Jerry Languasa. And I worked again with Jerry when I was in the private sector. He asked me, he had this vision of public, private, academic sector engagement, and he wanted me to organize a session for the Worldwide Open Science Conference that was held in Montreal, I think August of 2014, and we worked closely together. Jerry is a visionary guy. He will bring to this discussion, I think, a public sector perspective that is worldwide. Next slide. Jim Anderson. I've known Jim for, it seems like a long time, Jim. And we've had several discussions, both as when he's the chair of HMEI and when I did business with his company when I was at Weather Service. And what I find in Jim is a results-oriented guy who really has some perspectives that challenge the status quo. And so I'm hoping to hear some remarks from Jim along those lines. Next slide. Kevin, I have known and talked with at conferences, AMS conferences. I've heard him speak a number of times. Kevin brings a strong S&T background, and he works with a company that's service-oriented. And having service-oriented perspective on these kinds of engagements, I think, is important to the discussion. And next slide. And John Porter, a vice president at AccuWeather. When I was director of the Weather Service, I formed a very good partnership with them, and it gave me a growing belief that engagement is the way to go. So I'm hoping to hear good things from John as well. So let me transition off to the discussion we're going to have. I'll proceed with just a couple of remarks. I don't think I have to tell this audience that there's an increasing incidence of severe weather affecting society worldwide. Since 1980, depending on the source you read, you'll find that in 2015, 2020, we have 3 to 4 times the number of weather-related disasters occurring around the world. Cost to recovery, 5, maybe higher, 5 times what it was in 1980. And you look at a graph and you'll find in peak years it exceeds $300 billion to recover. At the same time, we've watched our science grow from what it was when I entered the business in 1970, where putting out a good 1 to 2 day forecast was a challenge, to one with the computers, the weather satellites, the observing systems we have, telecommunications. We're able to forecast now. We're pushing the boundary out to 7 to 10 days for reliable forecasts. And we're saving lives and mitigating or preventing damage in many cases. I think it's well known that there are service gaps between well-developed countries and lesser developed countries, and that gap's growing. And it is my hope that if we can generate a willingness to engage among the sectors as a team, we can build a weather enterprise that better addresses those things that threaten society. So the discussion today will be broken up into 3 parts. One, we'll start with challenges from a public service perspective. I'll ask the private sector to respond as they see challenges that they would like to address. Part 2 will be, I'll start with the private sector and say, all right, you understand the weather business in the public sector. What opportunities do you see out there to engage? And then I will go back over to the public sector and say, all right, give me some feedback on the ideas. And then at the end of this, hopefully, if we've gotten some attractive sounding ideas, the third part of this discussion is, like me, in 1985, when I first started it, I didn't know how to start an engagement with the private sector. And how do you start? And that's where I hope to draw this discussion to a conclusion. So let me start with my first question. And I'm glad we were able to connect Wasila, because if you couldn't, we were going to have to kind of retrench. But I'll start with a statement. Many national meteorological and hydrological services struggle with simply sustaining services today in developing those, struggling to meet their budget needs for operations and maintaining their systems. So Wasila, you have 2 decades of experience dealing with developing countries. I thought I'd start with you and ask you what you have seen over these past couple of decades.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you to my colleague panelists and also to the organizers of this panel discussion. It's really I'm pleased. So that's an opportunity for me to be here and to share my experiences. Of course, Jack, national med services in the developing world, we all know they face tough challenges related to budget issues. Of course, budgets are allocated by government and oftentimes limited to really paying salaries and also minimum cost for operation and maintenance. So the reality is that many developing countries really face tough socio-economic challenges related to health issues. For instance, we're dealing with the pandemic right now, related to education, related to food security, conflicts in some countries. So meteorology tend not to be really in the top priority list for the things that they want to advance. So that's the problem. It's a challenge because they tend not to. Government tend not to really realize or understand or appreciate.
Uh-oh. Wasila, if you can hear me, we've lost you from sound. Yeah. Oscar, you have his phone number. Could you give him his cell phone to call and advise him? And then I think it best, given the challenges we had connecting him in, that we change the course we're going in. And then, so Oscar, can you do that?
Of course, yes. I'm calling.
Okay. Okay. So Jerry, if I could, I'll ask you to step in and address the question from your perspective as Deputy Secretary General.
Hi, Jack. Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. It's a pleasure to be a participant in this process. I think Wasila already touched on the very core issues at the heart of the matter. I think as I normally would say when I was at WMO and in other forums as well, WMO is is greater than the sum of its parts, but equally it is as strong as its weakest link. And so the gains that you were talking about over the decades made in forecasting and predictions are at threat of being reversed purely because there are very many weak links in the chain. And so events such as the one that was mentioned earlier by Vladimir, which is the SOF initiative to try and raise funding to close the technology gap, are some very important initiatives. So for me, the perspective has always been that part of the challenge is not only in funds, but technology and people, and the right people. And I think there's vast opportunity to address those three aspects, perhaps as we discuss issues this evening. Funds, budget-wise, of course, is Wasila alluded to that already. And one of the key challenges there, of course, is that the pandemic has just tended to exacerbate and even make that even more pronounced, because most of the National Meteorological and Hydrological Services are dependent on government grants. Where they are more than dependent on government grants, for those, for example, that, as Niels mentioned earlier, that there were legal frameworks, even those that are allowed by legal frameworks to raise money outside of government grants commercially, are also struggling because one of their biggest clients is aviation, for example. And so the pandemic in closing down the airspace has closed down what is a crucial revenue source. And so the question is, and yet at the same time, we continue on the practice of economies being dependent on this issue. And maybe later on, when we have a much broader discussion on some of the solutions, I would like to venture just one thought at this point, which is that for all economies globally, the recovery post-pandemic is going to be directed at infrastructure investments. The bank and other partners, even the private sector, are going to be targeting infrastructure investments, whether it's green or sustainable or others. You're already talking about trillions of dollars being dedicated by various players and looking post-pandemic as to how you'd get the global economy to recover. And I think that there's an opportunity there for this community of ours, whether it's the private sector or let me say the weather enterprise as a whole, to benefit from that. But there has to be some critical innovative thinking about how best we can piggyback on those investments that are being touted in the trillions of dollars, because the reality is that indeed weather services, whether private or otherwise, are not considered a critical part of infrastructure. So when we talk about investments, we talk about it almost, the weather is like an afterthought. And so maybe there's an opportunity there to bring that to the fore and make it part of critical infrastructure discussions, especially as we spoke about these trillions coming up. So we can address those three issues: funds, technology, and people. Thanks.
Thank you, Jerry. Cornelia, as a sitting Met Service Director, could you share your perspectives on the challenges you face? And again, my focus is on what would give you some reluctance to engaging the private sector?
Thank you, Jack. I hope you can hear me.
Yep.
Welcome from Budapest to everyone. And it's a pleasure for me to be here as a panelist, and I'm happy to share my views with you. So I fully agree with Jerry that National Meteorological Services has different type of challenges, but I think the key challenge is the funding, and every other problems are rooted from here. So I think we have to find a solution that why. We have to answer the question that why the fund is a problem. And I think this funding issue is not really the question of limited government appreciation, at least here in Hungary, of course. Let me shortly introduce our situation here, just you can understand everything. In the last years, I had very, very trustful and fruitful relationship with my minister and with my state secretary. On the other hand, the state budget support of my service was only 20% of the total budget for many, many years. I think it's a depressing fact, just alone. But with this depressing fact, the Hungarian Meteorological Service was the national meteorological service with the lowest state budget in Europe. But besides the slightly decreasing state budget from year to year, our commercial revenue was doubled in the last 5 years. So we were quite successful, I think, and we succeeded in implementing large developments. So we could solve all our technological problems, as Jerry mentioned earlier. And as you can see, this business model worked quite well. And our government, of course, was quite satisfied with our activity. And since we didn't have financial problems, they believed that everything is in a perfect shape and no intervention is needed. But of course, from inside, we knew that we had to get somehow out of this tricky situation, which be honest, is on one hand it was fruitful, but on the other hand, it was too risky for us and not really effective solution. So just here's a consequence, I think, for the leadership role, that if you are a leader and do your best and have a very good strategy and apply very good business model and appropriate solution for the survival of your service, let's say, the government doesn't face the risk, doesn't face the problem So we are really responsible as leaders for the engagement at ministerial level.
Okay. Thank you, Cornelia. So what I'd like to do now is maybe switch over to the private sector and get your perspective on challenges you see on the public sector side, and focus on those that I guess the reluctance you see on the public sector side to engage with you. So Jim, can I start with you?
Sure. Thanks, Jack. I'll be the first to go. You know, I think it's interesting in terms of the reluctance of the way you framed it, the reluctance of the NMHSs to work with the private sector, and I think it's understandable in many cases. And as Camelia just pointed out, in many cases, the National Met Hydromet agencies are struggling to cover their own budgets and find funding. And I think, as everybody has already pointed out, we operate in an environment where funding is tight. It's not sufficient to meet the challenge at hand. Although I would also say it's not entirely a funding challenge. As I think we've all witnessed, there are a lot of programs that, as they get rolled out, the results are not, sustained over time. That maybe they have a limited time frame where new capabilities and systems are put in place, but then fairly rapidly those capabilities decline. I think there's a couple of things that could help foster, a better working arrangement between the private sector and the public sector. One is that in many cases, the National Met Hydromet agencies don't exist within a solid legal framework within their own countries to exist and have a mandate to exist and receive funding from their own government. And so in that, if that's your initial position, then that's a shaky ground on which to begin to partner with other organizations. Following on to that, having a data rights scheme within a geography that ensures that the National Met Hydromet agency is going to be able to get the information that they need. But from a private sector perspective, likewise, enable a business model that's sufficient to support their investment. So if a private sector company is putting resources towards building out an observing network or delivering services within a geography, they need to do it, or they prefer to do it, in a framework where they feel like they have sufficient IP protection and data rights protection, and that it's actually legal for them to do business in that geography. And so you need these things, these sort of legal frameworks working hand in hand to protect the National Met Hydromet service and ensure that they're operating under a good legal framework, but also providing that basis of a business model for the private sector. And I would say if you can accomplish these things, I think we tend to think of, and even the way this whole discussion is framed to a certain extent, and as you in your introductory comments, somehow we've got it in our heads that the private sector is pitted against the National Met Hydromet agencies, and I completely don't see it that way. I vigorously disagree with that framing. That when they work well together, that the private sector is actually creating a lot more awareness and support for these necessary services, and in doing so, creating a lot more attention for the National Met Hydromet Agency and showing the value for the services that they provide, helping them distribute their services to a broader audience, creating favor and support for the National Met Hydromet Agency within the policy community and the community that provides funding for, for the National Met Hydromet Agency. I can say, as the example of my own company, we spend a fair amount of time and energy fighting for the budget of the National Weather Service in the United States, because it's good business for us. We're not altruists. We're doing it because it's good business for us. And I think that same kind of virtuous collaboration, that supports everybody, can then help make the pie bigger for all. And certainly that's something that we need to do, right? The pie needs to get bigger. Anyway, I'll stop there because I've probably taken up too much time, but I'm happy to comment further.
Well, thanks, Jim. And sorry to put you in a hole with the way I posed the question.
Okay.
I'm going to pay you back because we all still remember in the United States 9/11, 2001. And 1 month after 9/11 took place, my boss, the Weather Service director, called him and said, I'd like to donate our observations in the nation's interest in case there's another terrorist attack. That's the kind of thing that has made me a strong, strong believer. And I maintained that relationship with Earth Networks at the time. I'm going to use that as a pivot. And Kevin, you had some interesting thoughts when you and I talked about what an engagement could do, what a private sector company would be willing to do, and how that might benefit an NMHS in the services it provides. So I'll turn the floor over to you.
Jack, appreciate it. I think, first and foremost, I want to leverage a little bit on what Jim said. I think it's important for us all not to look at the potential engagement from the direction that we've been looking in the past. Where there is challenge, there is opportunity. And we need to look at things from more of an opportunity standpoint. And there's plenty of opportunity for all in the weather enterprise, weather, water, and climate, whether it's public sector, private sector, academic sector. And I think the way we frame this discussion is important. Second to that, I would say it is essential for us throughout the enterprise to build a level of trust. Trust is foundational for how we can move forward in partnerships. And that trust does not come overnight. And we need to recognize that. How do we develop that trust? That trust is developed over time. One of the things that I think is important is to start small. If a private sector company is going to engage with a national Met service, vice versa, however you want to put that in your own context, start small. Find and identify a potential gap, and within that gap, look for those synergies. What are the benefits to both organizations? And when you find those synergies and those overlaps, it begins to create that opportunity to say, hey, let's bite off this piece and let's build on that and have some success. Once you have that level of success, that success builds a level of trust, and from there you can expand. And that's really essential. Let me add one other thing, and this holds true across our enterprise. We are all guilty of this. We continue to think in very old ways. We're thinking about things from several decades ago, particularly when it comes to business models. the way we have done things in the past is not going to be the same as the way we're going to do things in the future. And if we're going to be successful, we have to evolve our thinking about what do those business models look like. And I'm saying business models, that may not be the right term, but what I'm really after is, hey, maybe I don't deploy a network of stations anymore. Maybe I let somebody else do that and I get the data. That's a new way of doing business that maybe we haven't invested in before. Or, hey, maybe I don't buy hardware and put it in a server room. Maybe I use new cloud technology to advance, my goals and objectives. So this aspect of thinking about how do we do things in new ways is really going to be essential for us to be successful across the enterprise. Back to you, Jack.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. John, you and I talked in particular when Kevin mentioned start small. I was thinking the discussion you and I had in January. So maybe I'll give you a chance to say a few words.
Sure thing, Jack, and thanks for the invitation, and great to be with all of our friends and new faces from around the world. I've missed seeing everybody at our usual in-person engagements due to the pandemic, and look forward to returning to more normal operations here in the future. I agree with what my colleagues Jim and Kevin have pointed out as it relates to the opportunities and the thinking about things in a more creative way. Just to add on to what Jack was talking about there, I really do believe that the way to make meaningful change, meaningful transformative change within the weather enterprise globally is to continue to start building on success. And it doesn't have to be a huge success. Let's find ways that make sense to collaborate between industry and governments, and figure out how to start small with those types of pilot programs. Sometimes maybe it's just making a certain type of data available, or making performing a certain capability together. Celebrate that, figure out what worked, what didn't work, and as partners understand together what are the goals. Did we meet those goals? What could have worked better? What were the opportunities to expand going forward? And I find that's a much more successful way than trying to go in and come up with a huge boil the ocean type strategy, when we could really be focused on more actionable and kind of what we consider in a product world, sort of what's the minimum viable product, right? What's the place to get started to build the foundation, and then we can expand from there. I also agree with what Jim commented about, that too often there is this pitting of industry versus the public sector, and the reason is that exists is because that's the way it used to be. And that was the way that people had thought for a long period of time, that there weren't really great ways for industry and the public sector to collaborate. And I think what we found together over the recent decades is that there are many such opportunities. And if we're a little bit more creative, a little bit more open-minded about how we can work together, that we can really accomplish some new things that are very meaningful. And I want to highlight we talked about the private sector's role in helping get official government warnings out to people in harm's way. That's something we take very seriously here at AccuWeather. And we actually have integrated the official government warnings for over 65 countries in our apps and websites. So it really connects people in those countries to their government national Met services through our digital products in a completely new way. We've had so many times people contact us and say, I never knew my government issued warnings like that, when they're pushed out through our app to those users. So there's a big opportunity when we think about the kind of transformative technology change that's occurring around us. And as Jerry mentioned, the investment that we know is going to come from many sources post-pandemic. I do like the idea of, let's challenge ourselves to think creatively and differently about how we approach that shared public service mission. After all, we're all passionate about what we do because we can work together to get warnings to people to help them save lives and protect property. That's a common mission that we all have across the global weather enterprise. Thank you.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. Implicit in what you said, John, to me, it gets down to the words authoritative voice. And you shared some comments to me about your company's view of who's the authoritative voice, and I thought maybe I'd give you an opportunity just to say a few words about that.
Well, that point is a very important one in how we've approached all of the partnerships that we have with governments around the world. That many, obviously we create our own forecasts and significant weather content from a global perspective. But we also recognize the very important role that the governments have in terms of being that that source of the official public warnings. And we take that very seriously. All of the information from the governments is clearly identified as being from the government. It's actually front and center when there is a government warning issued. It's highlighted in our application. We have the logo of the National Meteorological and Hydrologic Service with it as well. And that again gets back to the point that Jim made about promoting the important role of the government's operations to people in their own country. That is a way that all of us can help to identify the important public service mission, which also argues for more funding of those foundational data services, because without the foundational observation systems and the public warnings provided from the various countries, that limits what can be done from a global perspective. So there are many of those opportunities to partner, and I would add one final point to it. It's also about the collaboration with those governments as well. So we work with the government med services to help them understand how many people are viewing, how many extra people they're able to access by way of our digital platform. And that is another way that they're able to identify really the significant impact of those partnerships with between industry and government. So it goes to creating, thinking creatively, and also recognizing each other's important roles in any kind of a partnership.
I thought maybe I'd give Jim and Kevin a quick opportunity to comment on authoritative voice, but then I want to switch back over to the public sector. So if you would, Jim, can we start with you on authoritative voice? Your company's view?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the comment there that you need to, and certainly it's HMEI's perspective, that we need to be supportive of the notion of the single authoritative voice for the National Hydromet Agency, and that private sector can support that. And within that, there's lots of room for the private sector to service the particular needs of a unique industry or sector or use case that's not sort of overall, public alerting and warning. But for those essential public safety alerts where you need to have really clear communication, absolutely, we have to support that notion of a single authoritative voice from government experts for these types of scenarios.
Kevin, anything to add?
I would just only add that, we don't want to be in the business of being that single authoritative voice. That is for the National Med Institutes to have that position. We are here to amplify, speaking for my own company, we're here to amplify that message and get it out to a broader set of people. So.
Yeah, and just my experience to conclude before I go back over the public sector, I think Jim mentioned it briefly, and as did John. And Kevin, you and I have talked this. 10, 15 years ago, we were struggling with getting the computational resources we needed in the National Weather Service. And people like me could go up and pound my fist on the table till the cows come home. And we're getting nowhere with the budget people in the Department of Commerce and on the Hill. And it was the private sector coming in and saying what value this has to the national infrastructure and to business within the United States that put us over the top and got us the upgrade monies we need for high performance computing. I would envision that there would be some willingness where there are opportunities where you could weigh in at a ministerial level in other countries to help the NMHS make its case to the ministers for the needs to increase budget. Okay, Jerry, you had some perspectives that you wanted to share, so I thought I would call on you next to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Jack. I'll just extend the same thought, actually, to the weather, which I expressed earlier about the WMO, to the entire weather enterprise. When I speak of these trillions of dollars of infrastructure investments, I mean, it almost takes you back to why are we in this business in the first place? And why are we doing what we do? Which is honestly to bring the best that science, the science of meteorology can bring to sustaining economies and supporting economies. Now, we used to have that broad statement that says saving lives and livelihoods is our core business. I think the time for those generic broad statements is probably past. I think we have to be, as an enterprise, much more specific about what it is that we do. And so this forum, piggybacks on an institution. The opening statements came from someone who heads up disaster risk reduction, right? And so we're saying, well, 80% to 90% of all disasters are attributable to either weather or climate or water-related hazards, right? And so if that significant a risk lies in the area of our science, and which are risks to the economy, global economy, local economy, from municipal level all the way out to national governments, then the question has to be asked, why would any government, for that matter, not be interested in where the specific information or data that they use or intelligence that they require comes from? So I'm sort of going back to that point that was made earlier. As an enterprise, we often amplify the differences or perceived differences between different parts of this ecosystem, as opposed to finding ways of proper engagement on where in the value cycle, who has what role to play. I think a Met Service has no argument about who produces a high-performance computer. There's no argument about that, because there is a service to be derived from that by the Met Service, or a government for that matter, which doesn't produce a high-performance computer. So that role is understood, and there is a constant conversation there about what the needs are for what kind of instrument or technology and for what purpose, right? The same, I think, we've evolved from those days where Met Services used to have workshops in their backyard, producing rainfall, rain gauges, and producing all kinds of Met instruments, that we've now accepted that there is a private sector capability to produce those instruments, those sensors, and those sensors evolve, and that there is a role to play for the private sector in that respect. And so I think where sometimes the tension comes, which is why this question about who's the authoritative voice, actually comes on the services side. So the value production are using that data and information. And I think it's there where we often have this stumbling block of who has this space, and we've left academia out of this discussion so far. But often it is in the research houses that some of those solutions lie, which are in academia and not necessarily in both the private and public sector. So in that sense, I go back to that initial statement that it's really about technology, people, and funding. And Cornelia added an interesting dimension about leadership and management in that context. It's the kind of community that we generate, which is not protective of its turf, but agrees to reaching out, opening up, having conversations, which are difficult. And I can understand that in the public sector, in some public sector, speaking to the private sector, you only do so through a tender. Any other conversation outside of that is frowned upon. And so I think that one of the things that is required to foster that kind of conversation is probably some kind of neutral broker type environment where the public sector manager who feels threatened by being able to have a conversation with the private sector, like you, Jack, often allude to, does not feel that they may be perceived to be favoring a particular industry or a particular vendor or a particular purveyor of services. And so I think it's providing the space, and perhaps through some independent mechanism. In some countries it doesn't exist, other than for labor dispute resolution or some things like that. But I think that it's something that we have to think about, maybe as an enterprise, is where can we create the space for those conversations to happen safely, so that people are not perceived to have been, influenced by a particular vendor to therefore go with a particular solution when the tender comes out.
Okay, thank you, Jerry.
Over to you, Jack. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good segue to where I think we want to go. But before I do that, I had one comment raised about the use of the term authoritative voice, in that it has a potentially negative connotation. So, and that's a good, that was a good comment. I think in my mind, if we took the enterprise to a point where we didn't worry about that term and we were all complementarily contributing, we had recognized roles that we all agreed to and contribute, then the whole context of, in some cases, it would be the government because that's their defined role. In other cases, it might be the private sector. I think from my perspective, we are where we are. And while that's a great vision, there are certain realities I think that we have to deal with to start down the path. And I think this discussion, at least in my mind, has told me start small, build trust. I had another comment about three important elements: transparency, trust, and accountability. So, and the comment ended with, okay, so if I buy this, where do we start? So let me ask for a volunteer rather than single somebody out. Is there someone who would like to talk about, if I were an NMHS, how would I start down the path to engage the private sector? Let me ask the private sector.
I'll offer a quick suggestion here, and it gets at one of Jerry's comments as well. And certainly, and I don't mean to be touting HMEI here, but as an association, we can act as an intermediary. We are the voice of the industry within the WMO. And we work to represent the industry broadly. So as a potential channel for engaging the private sector without feeling like you're, prejudicing, one company or another, or engaging in some type of discussion outside of a formal tender process that could be perceived as being prejudicial, or favoritism. That's one potential channel to do it. And the industry and the enterprise as a whole needs more forums like that. But I offer up HMEI as one for helping foster that dialogue.
I had a question in response while you were talking, then I'll turn the floor over to the others. Could OCP, the WMO runs, be that forum, Jim?
Yeah, absolutely. That's another, and certainly, HMEI represents the private sector within the OCP. So, yeah, that's another great way to do this.
Okay.
Jack, there are a lot of ways. I think Jim has called out some ways there, as well as the note there in the comments. But you think about societies, Meteorological Society, American Meteorological Society, another great place just to have the conversation. You can bring groups together and have some open dialogue and not feel like you're in a situation where you might be favoring one organization over another. So I think I think there are plenty of opportunities out there. We just got to search those out and utilize them.
And those kind of opportunities too, I think, are really important to just raise awareness of what some of the other issues are. I know one of our events global weather enterprise events in DC a couple of years ago, is we had some breakout sessions where we had groups of NMHS representatives and groups of industry at the same table working together and just talking through informally what are some best practices, what are some things that are working and what's not. I want to advocate for more of those kinds of collaborations because they really promote mutual understanding and building trust. Somebody made the good comment somebody made the good comments in the chat that there are still people in some probably in all camps that may think about things being in the old way of being very regimented in terms of industry pitted against the public sector. And I think that is the case in some places. And we do need to be realistic that that is still the case. But the only way to build upon that and move beyond it is to recognize the opportunities to work together in the future and to come together and start building the trust as well. You know, I've had some people say sometimes that their perception, sometimes governments perceive private sector entities in a negative light, not because of any of the private sector entities that are on the call or really anything that's happened recently. It's been events that happened in their own country many decades ago with various situations that occurred. So we have to realize that. That's the first step in terms of continuing to make progress, is that we do need to kind of reboot some of those relationships and recognize that trust comes over time, and it comes from being good partners and promoting good understanding together. And every opportunity we have to dialogue together, we should take it, because I guarantee you we'll learn new things.
Okay, I know Cornelia needs to jump in here as well, but I also just want to throw out and highlight, and this is not to say that this is the end all be all, but the National Weather Service has partner meetings where they bring industry together and sit down and say, here are our challenges. Can you help us meet those challenges? What are you guys seeing from your end? Partner meetings like that are absolutely great and really help us to move the needle.
Well, Kevin gave me a good lead in, Cornelia. So what's your perspective on your interaction with the private sector?
Yeah, it's a good question, but it's not an easy situation. So if you don't have, just going back to the funding issue, if you don't have enough funding, you have to reach the required level of income. Therefore, you have to sell or observation data and products. It means that you can share only basic information on free and unrestricted basis. Therefore, your cooperations and partnership possibilities are very limited because you have to sell everything. And all your developments are highly revenue dependent. So you have technological problems like Jerry mentioned earlier. So how you can build a strategy within these circumstances, this is the question. And to be honest, the general public preferably use free data providers. Basically, it means information from private weather companies here in Hungary. And therefore, your social embeddedness is nearly impossible. And it means, as it meant in Hungary, that a clear consequence, you lost your single authoritative voice. So this is a situation if you don't have really enough funding in a public Met service. And on the other hand, from the public sector viewpoint, we realized that new players challenged the meteorological market in the last decade, who introduced the competitive pressure in the network of national meteorological and hydrological services. So therefore, I think someone could feel that we are forced to change our traditional meteorological service model. So, and to be honest, I initiated a huge change here in Hungary 6 years ago. And honestly, my basic motivation for the change originally was not to serve the engagement of public-private sector. I handled at that time the private sector as an enemy, because we had to fight for the market, because I had to get my income. So it was not easy. It's not an easy situation for a national meteorological service who has not enough funding in this case. But there were another important fact, what you mentioned earlier too, that that Hungary had no legislation in the field of meteorological activity on that time. So the meteorological market here was really a free market. But I fully agree with you guys that besides the appropriate business models, which varies from country to country, and the lacking legal framework, the concerns over the losing the control of services can form barriers of the engagement. But as a first step, and it happened in Hungary, we could reach the peaceful coexistence. And if we can reach it, it's a good start together on the engagement path to develop the trust. So I think it's a good way to start, and I had to realize during my last years that this is the only way what we can reach together.
So it was to engage, take the risk to engage, and then find your way through that process. There was a side chat comment that there's so many private sector companies. You know, how do you engage them all? Well, you can't. Can you trust them all? Well, you can't. Some you can, and some you can't. Cornelia, would you agree with that statement?
Yes, so, I fully agree. I fully agree.
Yeah, yeah.
Jack,
yeah.
Can I just make one comment? And I hear what Cornelia has said around the funding issue, and I'm watching the chat. I can see some notes around funding. I'd like to make sure that we set the record straight in that the private sector has funding issues as well. You know, it's not like we are rolling in money and, you know, we can take on anything and go with it. What we do, and I think all organizations have to be in this kind of thoughtful mindset, is efficiency. When you don't have those funds, how can you become more lean, become efficient, come up with a strategy? And a strategy is really about what you do and what you don't do. There are certain things when we don't have funding, we're like, hey, we're not going to do that anymore, so that we can utilize our funds in such a way that fulfills our overall mission. So I just want to kind of put that perspective on the table, is that, hey, the private sector also grapples with this issue around funding.
Jack, can I offer to comment?
Yes, Wasila, I was going to call on you. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I think that we need to realize that, you know, there is really a big difference between services in the West and the developing countries. I think that, you know, NMHSCs really face real challenges. We talked about your legal framework, we talked about trust, we talked about transparency, we talked about a lot of funding going into developing countries. And this has been going on for a long time, but still, med services are still almost where they were about 10, 20 years ago. So we need to really figure out how we streamline funding so that it is available to med services. I think that everybody agrees that there are huge opportunities for public-private academia engagement to advance weather and climate services. Nobody can deny that. But I think that the issue here is that how do we go about it? I think that going back to Jack's question, for NMHSCs actually to initiate the engagement might be really a best way to achieve success, because they would identify the gaps and they would know where to go in order to fulfill that gaps, working with the private sector and also working with academia. And there are instances where it has worked very well. I know a country where, for instance, they contracted with the telephone company to disseminate warnings and advisories to the public. So the private company, the telephone company, you know, get compensated for services delivered, and the NMHS, get visibility, and also making sure that they reach out to the public to mitigate impact of natural disasters. But also at the same time, you have instances where private sector comes in without any consultation with NMHS and start providing services, and that becomes the problem. And oftentimes there is inconsistency in terms of messaging between what the private companies have to offer and what the med services have to offer. So I think that we need to be, I would like to really hear pragmatic solutions as to how do we empower med services to really be at a level where they can collaborate and reach out to the private sector and also to academia to make sure that they can advance their services. We talked about academia. Academia is important, but the problem of academia, and we see that also here in the United States, that is, academia is most interested in advancing the science, publishing research papers, and moving on. Here at NOAA, over the past several years, we have been changing the paradigm in terms of the funding that we provide by making sure that researchers that we fund collaborate with the Weather Service to make sure that the research that is being produced by academia can be transitioned into operations to support weather forecasts, climate forecasts, warnings, and advisories. So that paradigm, we need to apply the same paradigm in the developing world if we want to make really this successful, because with climate change, there's a lot of funding going to institutions in the developing world, but mostly it's just tailored toward climate change studies, scenarios, and not really necessarily addressing the needs and requirements of national med services to improve forecasts and warning and services. So I would like to just hear pragmatic solution as to how do we make sure that we foster collaboration between the private sector, academia, and NMHC, but in a way that it will really benefit to society.
So, John or Kevin, either one of you want to comment?
I think that the point about prioritizing the needs is an important one. I also think that the point about the frameworks is very important. That's come up in a couple of different interventions from various panelists today. The fact that in many countries there's not, and I've seen this happen firsthand, the government might want to collaborate with the private sector, might want to make some of its foundational data available, but they don't have an ability, they don't really know where to go next. And they feel sometimes a little bit uncomfortable about pursuing it with the ministry, or they don't know exactly how to frame it. And that's really where I think that sharing of the best practices from a WMO perspective to the med services to explain, here are the things, and there's been good progress on that in recent years, and sharing some more of those kind of success stories that can inspire other countries to build upon. The other thing was mentioned earlier in the discussion, and I think it's a part of the solution to this, is that we ought to be more creative about how we go about funding some of these projects. So for example, if the bank is going to invest in a big observation project, for example, to enhance basic foundational observations, surface observations, upper air data, maybe radar data, enhanced lightning, for example, just as a particular example, then also thinking about how do we bring interested, and maybe not everybody will be interested, but there may be interested private sector industry companies to the table who want to engage, that see an opportunity to use their technology and their capabilities to positively contribute to the project. And I always tell people sometimes, when you bring data, when you make foundational data available to innovators, to people who are software engineers, sometimes many times you're very surprised at the creative and valuable solutions that can come out of it. One of the important aspects is, though, I think sometimes governments have to recognize they're not going to be able to control every single little part in that value chain. The value chain in the meteorological services from a global perspective is getting very broad, as there's many different players that contribute unique solutions. And governments, if they recognize their critical role of empowering all that and making that data available, understand on all the funding issues and all the things that we've talked about before, but they focus on how do I get that foundational data out into and disseminated to a much wider audience. There are many, many really unique opportunities, I think, that can come out of that. And it does mean that there's a shift in thinking in some areas, and you have to focus your resources, back to what Kevin was talking about a strategy. It requires you to focus your resources where you think it can be most valuable toward getting your information out across the board. So I think those are a couple of the thoughts that come to mind as it relates to those specific challenges.
Kevin, did you have anything to add?
I think the only thing that I would add at this point is I want to highlight this academic component just for a minute here and say, John brought up great points of, we depend on the broader enterprise, particularly the National Meteorological Hydrological Services. That's a part of what we call the enterprise. And I want to highlight the fact that we depend on the academic sector as well. And one of the things that gets lost in conversations like this sometimes is within the private sector, there is a growing arm of research. A lot of that research is focused on the applied side of things, and there's still a dependence on that basic and fundamental research. And so we reach out to different academic players to help facilitate and foster that basic research. And those academic players are not in a position to what we would call productize or operationalize that. And that's where we come in. We might license the technology from a university and then put that into operations. So this is happening. I think it's actually, we're doing well in some areas. Can we grow? Absolutely. Can we bring in more players? Absolutely. I also just want to highlight one point that came up in the chat, and I don't want it to get lost. But the point came from Bill Hook. Hopefully he doesn't mind me calling him out on this. But his point was, how can we make a case with world leaders as they consider food, water, and energy critical infrastructure investments? That point in and of itself resonates with me, because when we talk about this overall funding, sometimes we all go into our little areas and, hey, we're going to talk to our government. We're going to focus on trying to get funding from them. And as a private sector, I'm going to go over here. I'm going to talk to this potential client. I'm going to try to get funding there. How do we, as an enterprise, share that bigger message? And I think Jerry hit on it earlier. It's like, hey, there's a bigger message that we should be sharing as an enterprise that helps all of our countries understand where those gaps exist, and the fact that we need to close those gaps. And the way that we do that is involving all pieces of the enterprise.
Really good comment. Jerry.
May I? Yeah, thank you very much. And just picking up on from Kevin, but probably with a slightly different emphasis on academia. I think we're dependent on academia in the enterprise, not only for the research around applications, but we're actually dependent on them for skills and acquisition of the people, again, addressing the third component. The people that we have in our institutions come out of those institutions. And therefore, if academia is still caught in the past and the way that we always used to do things 20, 30 years ago, in terms of how we train people, the kind of skills base that comes out of there is a challenge to the enterprise as a whole, not just the private sector, but also in government. So Cornelia spoke about leadership earlier. I think it's fair to say that in a lot of instances in academic institutions, we still focus on the technical side of things. And therefore, when it comes to management and leadership skills development, there's a huge gap, because these are highly technical institutions. Often I decry the fact that when I was a CEO, on my board would sit people who come with the notion of best practice. Now, for me, best practice, if you have not dealt with a scientific technical entity, is basically the lowest common denominator that you can find. So it doesn't encourage innovation, it doesn't encourage advancement, it actually pulls you down to an institution that is similar to one that just deals with stationery as its highest, or a computer, and a computer server at its highest probable acquisition in a year, right? And so I think that there is a huge gap that we need to close as well. And I know there are initiatives in the WMO, but academia needs to be responsive and engaged in how it actually helps close that gap, so that it's not just on academic research, but it's also around advancements in skills development of the kind of people. So it's not just people, but it's the right kind of people who are ready to lead, ready to engage. When you come to my Met Service, you engage me on my terms. It's my turf. I can determine what we are going to converse about. I can give you my 5-year plan and say, these are going to be my infrastructure investment plans or ideas over the next 5 years, and engage people broadly and generically around what it is that I'm going to be requiring assistance on, right? And I hear the comments about the global engagement, and I fully agree with that. Those platforms are necessary, HMEI, the associations at that global level, but the rubber hits the road at the national level, as Jonathan was saying. You know, that's where the rubber hits the road, and that's where the real conversations take place. And therefore, how do you actually build that trust and the ability to have those conversations in call it, even if you set it up in a Chatham House type environment, nothing that leaves the room. But often some of our directors don't even have knowledge about those systems where you can safely have conversations that are never quoted out of context or outside of that forum with no attribution to people. But those are skills that are learned, right? They're not just acquired. I mean, they are learned and they're taught. And so it's how academic institutions also come to the party in ensuring that, in fact, they're supportive of these notions. And I think we starting an academy, a leadership and management academy, quite soon, watch this space. But again, it's meant to address those kinds of questions. And we have a sense that it shouldn't be just about being supported by the private sector or governments alone. It's actually an enterprise concern. And therefore, we should be able to be supportive of it across the board. But I like the comment that Cornelia made earlier, which is really about sometimes at country level, the pressures are different about why you would want to open up and have a conversation. But it takes responsiveness and leadership to be listening to those pressures and hearing them, and then finding an appropriate response to what is clearly a pressing need that goes beyond just survival of the Met Service. I think in the end, it's about the quality of service and information that goes out to every single person that uses that output for decision making. Whether it's just the risk of hanging out your washing line because it's going to rain and kids go to school tomorrow, or to the business person that has to make a serious investment decision about the risks that they face. So I always go back to, why are we doing this? And for me, that's absolutely crucial for the enterprise, never to lose sight of that in spite of these challenges that we might have in our conversations and in our relationships, which are by the way, not insurmountable. It's the problems that seem to be perennial that we're trying to address, and I think we need to move to solutions to that. Thanks.
Thank you, Jared.
Over to you, Jay.
Well, before I make final concluding remarks, I thought I would offer an opportunity for the panelists just to give a last comment. Cornelia, can we start with you? Did you have any last thoughts that you wanted to share?
Yes, of course, but for this academic question, I cannot add too much because it's again an institutional question. Here in Hungary, the Met Service is a research institute as well, which means that some of my employees are members of the academia. So it's not a question anymore to engage with the academic sector here, only the private is a question. But let me highlight one opportunity about our engagement. We didn't talk too much about the open data policy, but some countries have already open their data policy, and some are far from the point to provide free and unrestricted data. Here in Europe, at least the legal solution is given by the quite new legislation called Open Data and Reuse of Public Sector Information, which define the meteorological observation as and observations and meteorological data as high-value data sets, the reuse of which is associated with important benefits for the society, the environment, and the economy, in particular because of their suitability for the creation of value-added services. So the meteorological data has to be provided free of charge in commonly used formats, should be machine readable, and should be ideally be available through an API, and so on and so on. So on one hand, at the moment, the countries are struggling with the challenge how to get the compensation for the lost income of national meteorological services. On the other hand, a common solution has to be defined and created for the data sharing. And the implementation of this technical solution for open data provision, I think it's a great opportunity where the two sectors could somehow cooperate. Over to you, Jack.
Thank you, Cornelia. John, final thoughts?
Yeah, I think very interesting conversation here today. I want to thank everybody for their ideas. And again, back to my point earlier about sharing ideas and sharing your point of view, I think really does help to continue to move us forward, which I think is a very positive thing. And Jack, thanks to you and the bank for putting this together. I think I once again am struck by the type of opportunities that we have. We are going to have to think creatively and differently, and think about how to apply some of the latest technology trends to the social and economic impacts that we can have as a community. I think the other thing that strikes me here too is again about sharing the best practices and sharing about the success stories that work from a WMO perspective to the member countries, so there can be better engagement around what type of interactions are possible and what success can look like. I think that can be inspiring. And the other thing I just kind of thinking about is there a way we can put together as a working group, what are the top priorities that we see from a global perspective in terms of really making a difference as it relates to the emerging economies, the countries that are facing some serious challenges in terms of getting their basic foundational systems funded and information out to various audiences that need it. There may be interesting ways for the sectors to work together to solve those. So while there are many of those kinds of needs, I think let's try to articulate what some of them are, and there may be some very interesting and creative solutions that people within this group are interested to work on together. So that's what I would say. Thanks again.
Thank you, John. Kevin, final thoughts?
Thanks, Jack. I'd also like to just thank all the organizers for a great session. I could really talk on some of these topics all day. This is so interesting, some really great points. But there's maybe three things that I would leave with the group and the audience. And some of you who've heard me talk before have heard me say this. And I think this was brought up previously by Wasila, but he brought it up from a national meteorological, hydrological standpoint. Within the private sector, there is a considerable amount of diversity. So when you say the private sector, I would love for people to recognize that not all companies behave the same. They don't all have the same approach, and that should be taken into account. Second, I would love, when we talk about public-private partnerships, you know, that we all take the time and think about, hey, I want to sit down and understand the other side. I want to understand, what are your motivations? You know, what are you grappling with? Too many times we're just thinking in our own little bubble and what's important to us, and that blocks our ability to work with one another. When we understand the motivations of different parties, it really opens up the door. And then my final thought is, I'm going to take from something that Jerry said earlier in the call. I thought was really important. Doesn't necessarily have a lot to do with kind of the public-private partnership aspect, but it has to do with the way we communicate about our industry. For so long, we've talked about the protection of life and property. When we talk about weather, we have to start to get away from what's the weather tomorrow. We have to get to what's the impact. And then we have to translate that to how does that impact the economy of different countries. When you start talking money, dollars, cents, that really perks up the ears of policymakers, and they're thinking, wow, we lost that much money on this event. How can we not only save property and lives, but how can we make our economy resilient in the face of high impact weather? So thank you, Jack, appreciate it.
Thank you. Wasila, some final thoughts?
Yes, thank you again, Jack, for inviting me. Very interesting conversation. I think that, we all know the challenges that National Met Services face, institutional, infrastructural. We talked about education, human resources, and planning, and so forth. So, and with global warming and extreme events being more and more frequent, I think that the demand for weather and climate services is far greater than NMHCs can provide. So I think that it is really an excellent opportunity for public-private academia engagement to really benefit society, not just NMHCs, but benefit society. It just has to be done. I think it's good to have a global framework, but I think that we need to be pragmatic. This has to be visited at the national level and maybe at the regional level, because we talked about legal framework is important. Some countries have legal framework for public-private partnership, and some countries don't have that. So I think that we need to really be careful in how we go about it. And I mentioned the fact that initiative coming from weather service, from Met Service is important. Private sector can also be proactive in identifying gaps, but also communicating through proper channel with NMHCs to make sure that they can come to a common understanding of what needs to be done and how to do it. So I think this will build trust, and that's what Kevin has mentioned. I will also have mentioned that. I think that there are tremendous opportunities before us. For my work, forecasting of hazard forecast, flooding, heat waves, how they impact population. Those are very key to NMHCs, and many of the NMHCs are not in a position to deliver those services. So I think that there are opportunities for the private sector to come in, to also engage academia. I think Jerry mentioned it nicely, not only through the research, but also through the tools that they can also transfer to the NMHCs so that they can upgrade their operations. All of these are important. I think it is possible. And I would like to see a solution. And this is why in the discussion I had with you, Jack, I mentioned pilot projects, identifying countries where, at least a couple of countries where we have a good chance for success, and see how we can develop a strategy for enabling true public-private academic engagement, building from those successes and expanding to other regions and even globally, perhaps. So anyway, thank you very much, Jack, for the invitation. It's really nice to be here to contribute. Thank you.
Yeah. Jerry, I'll turn the floor over to you. We've kind of run over our time, but go ahead. I want to give you an opportunity to make some final thoughts.
Thank you very much, Jack. And I would echo the same sentiment. It's a pleasure to be back. For me, at least, I've been in a hiatus for a while away from the community, and being back is great to meet again with Cornelia and others remotely. I've been in chats with IBM locally in South Africa as well about the weather offering. And so I think one of the key things, I mean, for me is also to thank the World Bank and the World and the forum, the Enterprise Forum, for putting this together. I think it's important to have these conversations. And as Niels summarized at the beginning about the sequencing of events and what had been discussed previously, to where we are now, I think that the global challenge that we face as a society calls on every aspect or every part of science in service to society, that, and for us as a meteorological community, and by meteorological I mean not just weather but climate and ocean competencies as well as water competencies, have to bring to bear on the challenges that the world face. We have a golden opportunity now. So there's a popular saying that says, never lose the advantage of a crisis or something, something like that. I'm paraphrasing. But basically, we are in the midst of a crisis. It may be a health crisis, but we know that it, as a pandemic, it has huge impact on economies and economic recovery path for the globe is calling for infrastructure investments as one of the driving mechanisms for that recovery. And we have an opportunity, I think, as an enterprise to really make telling statements and telling contributions that will have resounding impact beyond the pandemic and beyond that recovery for what the Met Services and the weather enterprise will look like as we head very fast towards what has always been said by the IPCC, contributions from this community through various forms, that the world will look like come 2030, 2050. And so we have to be ready even on those fronts to ensure that as a science we are ready to really contribute to sustainability and future improvements in society. It's been a privilege to be part of this conversation, and thank you very much for the invitation. And as I said, it's good to see members of the community again, and in the chat, we've been catching up with a number of them. And I look forward to our future collaboration as well going forward. Thank you very much, Jack.
Well, I guess I'm going to make some brief remarks, but I'll start with, I would have liked to have had more time today. This was a huge issue. I was kind of intimidated when I started down this path. I think what you've heard today and what we've discussed are some of the challenges, not all of them. We've had some ideas for how engagement might provide a basis for a win-win collaboration. And we've had some thoughts about how to start. I started this with the idea that engagement starts with the leadership. And that certainly came through in the remarks I heard today. And it's not leadership on the public sector side, it's leadership on both sides. Kevin mentioned to me when we first talked, it takes someone with a long view. That's what a leader does. We all have pressing challenges just surviving from day to day. It's the leader who says, where do I want to go and how close can I come? I think I heard there has to be a willingness to take risks, risks that engagement brings. And then there's an expectation. And that expectation is, even with the best of intentions, it may not produce anything more than an interesting discussion. On the other hand, I believe that if you start down that path and you're committed to that path, that you can create win-win situations, which might be microscopically small at the outset, but could grow into something much bigger. I've had it in my career, and that's why I'm so firmly behind this whole concept of collaboration. The challenges that an NMHS faces, challenges that the community faces are immense. And so to me, I heard today a willingness of our private sector participants, we're ready to engage. No strings attached. We'd like to explore and better understand your needs. Better, as Kevin said, understand the way you do business and have you understand the way we do business. So to me, I look to the future. We have a warming atmosphere. We have every expectation that significant weather impacts are going to increase, and the cost to recover from those are going to increase. These are challenges that no one sector can meet on its own. And there are challenges which I firmly believe could be better met by a collaboration, not just with public-private, but also the academic sector. And in my mind, the transformation is one where if there is competition, we make that complementarity. And it only starts with that engagement. So I think that's pretty much what I had. I know, Vladimir, we had advertised a Q&A period, and I don't want to hold our panelists over. I would say I'm willing to engage anyone who has questions that they didn't get a chance to answer. I try to monitor the chat and bring those into the discussion, but I'm willing to engage with anyone after the fact if they will finish today without getting their questions answered. Okay, over to you, Vladimir.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks, everybody. Panel discussion was excellent, colleagues. It brought so many topics, so I was building my notepad with different ideas, which I don't know to unload because it would require another 90 minutes probably. But few points to follow up to this. And I was looking at this discussion, rich discussion again, from the standpoint of how can we, as a development institution, contribute to building thriving well enterprise in the developing country. That's a even bigger challenge than the one which we discussed. And to me, the whole point of PPE is a critical for improvement of that in developing countries. Without this collaboration, there is no, maybe I'm too blunt, but it's hardly to imagine the future improvement because of the status of NMHS in many countries. And I fully agree with Cornelia's point that lack of funding is still a major obstacle for good cooperation because it creates an environment of disengagement and competition. And in the current situation in many countries, the government pretends to pay NMHS and NMHS pretends to deliver what is needed and all suffer. So that's a lose-lose situation. And how to break that is, there is no solution yet because there are many solutions which we should try together. And only together, again, with private sector, with academia, with WMO management, with PRs, which hopefully next time we will have more PRs like Cornelia sitting with us and talking on their experience, we can break that, unfortunate situation. What I want to also support, and that among many ideas, there was idea to start with successful cases, start small. We have to find those few cases where we can demonstrate success, and that's a critical for convincing the future development path. And we also should show what is this, and I think it was Kevin's point that we have to know what is the business of weather now. It's very different indeed, and most of our clients in developing countries are still pushing us to build old 20 years ago models. And we cannot do much without their understanding what is this new business model supposed to look like. So again, together we should move towards that better understanding. And therefore, what I suggest, colleagues, to you and to Jack and to my colleagues from the Global Weather Enterprise, we should consider how to structure in other discussions of similar topic, because it's a long sequence of, it should be a long sequence of events. And then focusing on discussing new ways of doing business in developing countries. We will be happy to support it to the extent possible. And with that, at least I don't want to continue unloading all this important point which you delivered. Thanks again for your time. Thanks for you, Jack. Thanks a lot for you. I know that you spend an awful lot of time bringing together this outstanding panel and bringing this good discussion. We had during most of the time 120 to 140 participants. Now it's down to 81, so still a good audience. Thanks everybody, and thank everything for everything, and we will see you, let's say, in, I guess, next month we have another event which you're all invited. We will have ECMWF chair presenting some of her ideas in April. All the best to you. Thank you.
And thank my panelists again for the time they spent with me and today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Jack.